Okay, 11:03, we shall get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this last in the 21-22 season of the Precision webinar, Precision Convergence webinar series. I am Laura Dubé, and I will invite my colleague Sean Brown to introduce himself in 30 seconds. This series is co-hosted by the McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economics and the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. Sean, why don't you introduce yourself? Then I will introduce myself in the series and our keynote today, Lauren Ross.
Hi, my name is Sean Brown. I'm the director at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, a joint computational research center between University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm vice chancellor for research computing at the University of Pittsburgh. And welcome everybody. Well, thank you, Lauren, for agreeing to give our keynote, and I'm excited to hear today's talk.
Thank you. Myself, I'm James McGill, Chair of Consumer and Lifestyle Psychology at the Desautels Faculty of Management, and the founding chair of this McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economics. That is more than a multi-faculty McGill. It's primarily a whole network of like-minded scientists and action leaders concerned about accelerating our capacity to address major challenge of our modern society. We started the series in the wake of the COVID-19 high-performing computer consortium that was spearheaded by IBM and other digital company, as well as institutions like PSC with Bridge 2 and others that were engaged in making possible what was called 10 years ago by Philip Sharp, the convergent science, which is bringing the omics of the COVID-19, bringing the clinical, the biotechnical aspects, but also the computer and computational modeling to accelerate our solution to COVID-19. And essentially, what this precision convergence go further is to say, what if we were to bring the omics of human brain, human body, and human behavior with all the various multi-scale mechanisms that are at play, not only in the brain and biology and disease, but that are also at play in our ability to create a real-world solution in the context that we are creating for human behavior. And this is within that context that the series over the last year has been a combination of the study of the man, or I should say human, not man, machine, but also domain-specific real-world solution. And the series is a capacity building more than a webinar just for sharing knowledge. It is really with the objective of creating this worldwide collaborative for accelerating our solution, whether it is to physical or mental health, or whether it is sustainability. Can man and machine evolve for a better future in a timely manner? And within that context, clearly, that requires a full diversity of science and a full diversity of action leader. So the 2 hours that we are blocking everyone's time are following the script that we have a keynote that bring core vision about how to advance concretely toward this smart science. And the panel is formed around the keynote to bring the complementary expertise to advance toward this precision convergence as it may apply in context of mental health and so on. So the 2 hours are essentially a first 35 minutes by the keynote, Then we have a first round of commentary by the panel, where each of them react to some part or build upon to some part of the keynote presentation, and bring also their own perspective in advancing this next generation precision convergence science. Those comments are 3 to 5 minutes maximum. Then the keynote give a quick reaction to each of them. We then have a second round where each one is invited to kind of have the 30-second, 1 minute next step if we are to move toward accelerating this smart science. So if you have a question from the audience, you put them in the chat box, and my colleague Sean will be checking on this and get them in as appropriate. So with this, if everybody have a sense of what we are doing for the next 2 hours, I'm extremely pleased to end this series by welcoming Lauren Ross. Lauren is an associate professor in logic and philosophy of science at UC Irvine, and her research on causal reasoning and explanation in terms of their diversity and complexity is extremely relevant. We have been having over the year a lot of advance in multi-scale coordination dynamics, advance in how those complex architecture, whether it is computationally or in terms of the machine infrastructure. So this is very relevant to have today this talk by Lauren on distinction among causation in neuroscience and biology, but we will build upon this in the broader framework of smart science for real-world transformation. So Lauren, why don't I let you take over? Welcome.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here today. My talk today is on causation in science, and I'm going to focus in particular on causation in neuroscience and in biology. Causation is a topic that receives a huge amount of attention, of course, in both of these scientific fields, but in many others as well. It also receives a lot of attention in the philosophy of science literature. The reasons for this are numerous, and they include the fact that causation is central to explanation, and explanation is central to science. In fact, explanation is often considered a primary objective of science, and one of the most important things that scientists do, if not the most important thing that they do. So if you want an explanation for COVID, for a patient's neurological symptoms, or for any behavior of an animal model, usually what you want to identify are the causes that work together to produce these outcomes. These could include a virus, a neuronal defect, a genetic factor, or some combination of all of these that are working together to produce that outcome. In addition to explanation, we're also interested in causation because it gives us information about prediction, control, and responsibility. We use causes to predict the likelihood that an effect will occur. We target them to control and to change outcomes, and we cite them as responsible for and to blame for their effects. So causation is very central to scientific work, and it supports many goals that we have in science. Because of the centrality of causation, it's important that we understand it in the right way, that we are clear about what we mean by causation, and that our accounts of it capture the success of science but also the complexity and the messiness of the world that we're in. We want our accounts to be realistic. To show how these points relate to real life and real scientific concerns, consider the following example. In recent conversations that I've had with a number of neuroscientists, one thing that a number of them have mentioned is that scientists in their field appear to use causation in many different ways. When they say that X is a cause of Y, it appears as though they have different conceptions of causation in mind. This is important to take note of for all sorts of reasons. The first reason is, of course, that if two people have different definitions of causation in mind, and they don't realize this, it's very easy to talk past each other. A second reason to be interested in this, and an interesting assumption that shows up, is it's often assumed that using different definitions of causation is a kind of problem. But this is only a problem if you think that there is a single correct account of causation. It could be the case that there are many different types of causation in the world, and that we need different definitions to capture these types. So this is something that should be argued for as opposed to assumed. The claim that there's a single kind of causation in the world. Third, sometimes scientists use and rely on causal distinctions that capture an important difference across kinds of causes or causal relationships, and it's automatically assumed that these require different definitions of causation when they actually don't. So consider that causes can be fast or slow, they can be proximal or distal, they can be stable or unstable. These are all important distinctions, but they're not necessarily relying on completely different conceptions of causation. So causal distinctions don't imply different causation definitions. This is something that it's important to explore further, and is part of what we'll take a look at today. These are the differences that I'm going to examine more today. Cases where causation is used in different ways and different types of causation. The notion of there being different types of causation is often associated with the phrase causal pluralism. Pluralism here is referring to there being many of something, and the suggestion, of course, is that there are many different types of cause or causation. It turns out that this phrase, causal pluralism, it seems like it might be simple, but it's quite ambiguous without further clarification. What I'm going to do today is to clarify different types of causal pluralism that matter for science. We will examine what they mean, whether they are scientifically accurate or not, and why they matter. This is going to provide a kind of taxonomy of causal pluralism that will help us in scientific discussions where we're clarifying what we mean by causation. Given these goals, the plan for the rest of my talk today is going to come in two main parts. First, what I'm going to do is outline three main types of causal pluralism. And then throughout an analysis of these types, and in the second part of this talk, I'm going to indicate how these relate to scientific work and why appreciating these types matters. My goal is going to be to specify these types in a way that will allow you to decide whether your scientific work is consistent with some of these causal views over others, to clarify what your work tells us about the causal structure of the world, and to do this in a way that allows you to best communicate this work to others who might have their own conception of causation in mind. A helpful place to start here is by outlining three different types of causal pluralism. These are definitional pluralism, methodological pluralism, and structural pluralism. What do these types have to do with? Well, definitional pluralism has to do with how causation is defined. Methodological pluralism has to do with how causation is studied. And structural pluralism has to do with different types of causal structures in the world once you've accepted a definition of causation. So let's take a look at these types and explore why they matter. When scientists argue about how to understand causation, and when causal pluralism comes up, it's most commonly in reference to definitional pluralism. This concerns how to define causation. Providing a definition of causation involves answering the question, what is it? What is causation? In other words, when you identify a causal relationship, what are the characteristics that make it causal? In virtue of what is that relationship a causal relationship? Philosophers, scientists, and many other people have been focused on defining causation for millennia. Aristotle is focused on this in 300 BC. Hume is working on this in the 18th century, and there's a lot of modern work on causation that relates to these earlier philosophical accounts and very much takes into consideration scientific work on causation and how scientists reason causally. After all of this time and all of this research on this topic, what's the best way to define causation? What's the consensus? Well, there isn't any consensus, but there are common accounts that come up in this literature. So let me give you 4 main accounts of causation that often show up in the philosophy of science literature. 4 very common accounts of causation are regularity accounts, probabilistic accounts, process accounts, and interventionist accounts or counterfactual accounts of causation. What it means to say that you are a pluralist about the definition of causation is that you think 2 or more of these definitions of causation or any others are correct. And relatedly, to say that you are a monist about the definition of causation means that you think there is one correct definition of causation. This topic and the status of these accounts are very heavily debated. Should you be a pluralist or a monist about the definition of causation? Well, let me introduce these accounts to you so that you can start to answer this question for yourself. A first account of causation to consider are regularity accounts. These have an early description in the work of Hume. Standard regularity accounts view causation in terms of regularities between causes and effects. In this sense, effects are outcomes that regularly follow from their causes. Another phrase that captures this regularity feature is constant conjunction. This is what Hume uses in his work. So for example, when someone has no vitamin C in their diet, something regularly follows from this. They get scurvy, they get the disease scurvy. The regular occurrence of scurvy after a deficiency of vitamin C captures a causal relationship. For most causal relationships, once the cause is triggered, the effect is going to follow in a regular fashion. So you might think that regularity is the key feature of causation. But there's a problem here. One thing that we've all heard is that correlation isn't causation. One problem for these accounts is that some mere correlations or spurious correlations also have this regularity feature as well. So if we consider an example of this, we can consider an example that shows up as a problem for this. Consider Lyme's disease as an example. In this case, when a person is infected with a particular bacteria, this causes 2 main things. First, it causes this bullseye rash, and second, it causes Lyme's disease, a disease that is characterized by lethargy, weakness, and many other symptoms. This is a common cause situation in the sense that there are 2 effects that have the same cause. They have a common cause. The problem here is that both of these effects are constantly conjoined. One of them regularly follows from the other. An individual first gets this bullseye rash, and then they reliably get Lyme's disease. If you think that constant conjunction alone, or this regularity feature alone, is causation, then you're going to claim that this rash is a cause of Lyme's disease, when it's not a cause of Lyme's disease. It's correlated with it. So this definition is going to run into challenges because it will count some mere correlations as causal relationships when they're not. Obviously, this is a problem. A second challenge for these accounts are imperfect regularities. These are cases where an effect doesn't always follow from its cause. There's an imperfect regularity here. So consider that we often claim that smoking causes lung cancer, even though it doesn't always cause lung cancer. If you think that causation is characterized by a kind of perfect regularity, then you won't be able to capture the fact that we think that's a legitimate causal claim. These are pretty difficult counterexamples to overcome, and this has led many to prefer other definitions and accounts of causation. Another account of causation that's often considered in these discussions are probabilistic accounts. These claim that causes increase the probability of their effects. A nice advantage of this account is that unlike the regularity accounts, these do capture imperfect regularities, where an effect doesn't always follow from its cause. So we can now recover the fact that we think smoking is a cause of lung cancer because it increases the probability of lung cancer, even if it doesn't always cause it in every single case. However, one thing that we find is we still have this correlation problem showing up. Notice that with our Lyme's disease example, the presence of this bullseye rash raises the probability that Lyme's disease will occur, but they aren't causally linked. This is something that shows up for other mere correlations that are very useful for prediction. We see this a lot in medicine, where you have a biomarker that allows you to usefully and reliably predict the occurrence of the disease, even if the biomarker isn't a cause of that disease. The fact that these factors and others can predict with high probability doesn't mean that they're causal. So again, we have this correlation causation difficulty showing up. A third account of causation are process accounts. These accounts claim that causes are factors that are capable of transmitting something onto their effects. They're usually referred to as mark transmission accounts because a cause is thought to be capable of transmitting a mark onto its effect, where a non-causal process lacks this capacity. You might think that this is compatible with tracer and tagging experiments in science, where you have a scientist tagging some material and then watching it as it flows through the steps of the causal process, allowing them to identify these steps. While mark transmission is a feature of some causal relationships, it doesn't appear to be a feature of all of them. An interesting set of examples that these accounts struggle to deal with are cases that we call absence causation, where an absence of a cause produces an outcome. So if we think of that scurvy example, it's a nice case where you have the absence of a vitamin causing a disease. There are many other cases of this in the life sciences. In the neurosciences, you can have a lesion of the brain where there is a lack of functioning of a particular area of the brain, and it's often said that that causes some kind of symptom in the patient or a behavioral output. In that case, there is an absence of functioning that is said to cause something. What's interesting about these cases and why they're a challenge for these process accounts is that it isn't clear that the absence of something can transmit a mark onto its effect. So these accounts struggle to capture the fact that we think these are genuine causal relationships. Some philosophers just bite the bullet here and they deny that these examples of absence causation are really examples of causation. In my view, if they cared more about science and scientific reasoning, they wouldn't do this. They would take the causal reasoning that we find in science more seriously. A fourth and a final account of causation to consider are interventionist accounts or counterfactual accounts. One of the main proponents of this type of account is James Woodward. He has written on this in his well-known book, Making Things Happen, and in many other publications. On these accounts, causes are factors that give you control over their effects. A cause is a factor that can be manipulated and changed such that when it's manipulated and changed, it gives you control over and it changes the effect outcome. These accounts reflect the fact that scientists often identify causation with experiments where a candidate cause is changed, and then you see if this produces a change in the effect. An important thing to note is that these accounts don't require that causes are actually manipulable with current technology or ethically. Sometimes it's unethical to manipulate a candidate cause. What these accounts claim is that if that factor were to be manipulated and changed, it would produce, in a counterfactual sense, that outcome or that effect. And we can often get information about this even when we don't actually perform the intervention. We can examine natural experiments, and we can use statistics to do this. So a central feature of these accounts is control. Causes are factors that provide control over their effects. And one of the huge advantages of this account is that now we can handle these correlation causation examples. So with our Lyme's disease case, we can see that the rash isn't a cause of this disease, because if we were to intervene on this rash and change it, treat it with a corticosteroid or something else, this doesn't give us control over whether Lyme's disease is present or not. However, intervening on and changing the presence or absence of this bacteria, this does give us control over the Lyme's disease outcome. This is because that bacteria is a cause of this disease. It's a relevant cause for that outcome. This interventionist framework is very popular in the current philosophy of science literature. So if you think that we need all of these accounts to capture causation in the world, then you are a definitional pluralist. And if you think we need just one, then you're a definitional monist. The only suggestion that I'm going to make here is that while it's often important to be open to different definitions of a concept, what we don't want is an anything goes type of pluralism. Causation isn't a matter of subjective preferences. I don't get to just decide what causes a disease. This is determined by rigorous standards and objective facts about the world. If we accept an account of causation, it better be good. It better not have lots of counterexamples, especially counterexamples that often come up in our domain of study. We should only do so, we should only accept an account of causation if we have very good reason to. Now, a second type of causal pluralism that it's important to introduce and discuss is methodological pluralism. This refers to there being either one or many methods that can be used to identify, establish, or prove that you have a causal relationship in the world. So consider different methods that have been used to do this. We have Koch's postulates. These are often viewed as the first causal proof ever provided that established that a bacteria is the cause of a disease. We have randomized control trials, lesion experiments, the potential outcomes framework. We have Hill's criteria, which identify features common to causal relationships, although not found in all of them. Now, if someone claims that only one of these methods can be used to identify causation, then they're a monist about the methods of identifying causation. And if they think that many methods can be used, then they're a pluralist. They're a methodological pluralist. While there is a lot more debate about the first type of pluralism, definitional pluralism, there's a lot less about this type. Most people are methodological pluralists. They think that we do have different methods that allow us to successfully identify causal relationships. There's an important point to make here that I think can sometimes be confusing when we look at causation in science. Just because you are a pluralist about the methods used to identify causation, this doesn't mean, and this doesn't make you a pluralist about the definition. You could hold, for example, that only one definition of causation is correct. You could hold that just the interventionist account is correct, and still accept that there are many different methods you can use to find causation in the world. So importantly, just because you see scientists using different methods doesn't mean that they're using different definitions of causation. Many methods can be compatible with the same definition. Finally, our third type of causal pluralism is structural pluralism. This has to do with different types of causal relationships and causal structures once you have a definition of causation in place, or kind of beyond a definition of causation. One of the easiest ways for me to clarify this type is to give you some examples of it. So first, consider a sequence of causal steps where we have just a simple linear causal chain. This, of course, is a very common causal system. And one distinction that often comes up in this type of system is between distal causes that are upstream in the causal links of this chain, and then proximal causes that are downstream and closer to the final effect. These causes, proximal and distal, are different in terms of their causal control, their causal location, and their explanatory power. Now notice how you can appreciate and see this distinction between distal and proximal causes without first picking a definition of causation. In fact, we don't even have to agree on how to define causation, but we can both appreciate this difference between distal and proximal causes. This is because this isn't a distinction that's captured at the border of one definition or account of causation versus another. It's a question beyond what causation is. It concerns further differences across types of causal relationships and types of causal systems. Now, distal and proximal is just one distinction. There are many, many causal distinctions that come up in science and in everyday life contexts, and that are very important to capture in order to fully represent the causal complexity and diversity of the world. As another example of this, consider that the ways that causation can differ, or that causes can differ, at a single step of this causal chain. At a single step of this causal chain, you can have a cause that is fast or slow. It could be stable or unstable, specific or non-specific. It could be reversible, or it could produce its effect in a manner that's irreversible. It could transmit material to its effect or not. And the list goes on and on and on. And this is just at the level of a single causal step. If you look beyond a single causal step at many steps that are combined in different organizations and different patterns, you're going to see further differences across types of causal systems. We can start to see this if we start with our linear causal chain and compare this to another causal system, such as a feedback loop. We find these in metabolism, climate change, and many other contexts. We can compare these systems to yet another, which is a bow tie structure. Here you have a fan-in, fan-out configuration of causal steps, many causes that all converge on a single node. That's the knot of the bow tie, and then they all diverge from that point. This is a system that we find in our immune system. We find it in the brain. We find it in everyday life. Roadways can have this kind of structure. Yet another type of system is what is commonly called a final common pathway. In this system, you have many causes that all converge on and operate through the same cause and the same pathway to produce the same type of effect. These are systems that all differ with respect to the organization of their causal steps or the causal links. There are further differences across types of systems that are more complex, that have other features besides organization of causal steps. Examples here include things like mechanisms and cascades. A mechanism often refers to a causal system that has a kind of nested or hierarchical character. Typically, mechanisms have lower level causal parts. They all interact together to produce some higher level behavior of the system. A cascade is a different type of system where you have sequential amplification. You have a single cause producing many effects. Each of these produces many more effects. And if you join up these amplification steps in series, you get a huge explosive outcome at the very end. These are all different types of causal systems. This captures pluralism about the causal structure of the world and the different types of causal systems we find in science. One of the fascinating things about this type of pluralism is that these structures are often associated with unique terms, analogies, and expressions. If you pay attention to the causal language we use in science and in everyday life, they pick out these unique types of structures. You can see this with the bow tie case, right? This is named for a reason. It looks like a bow tie in everyday life that you'd wear on your neck. The central node of this structure is the knot of the bow tie, and then you have this fanning in, fanning out. We also see this with the mechanism concept. Systems that are referred to as mechanisms are often analogized to machines that we interact with in everyday life. They have similar features. We see it yet again with the cascade concept. One of the first uses of this concept in biology, the blood coagulation cascade, McFarland, the individual who names this system, explicitly states that it's named after sequential amplification in electronic systems. It's also analogized to cascading water down a mountain face, where you have this fanning out of an initial cause to these effects. It's of course also analogized to the snowball effect and the ripple effect that have the same kind of structure. Now, it might not be clear yet why appreciating these different types of systems matters. Let me give you an example of one of these to show you why this is the case. One nice example of the importance of these structures, and one of them, is found in work on lesion network mapping, which relies on the human connectome and single lesion analyses. In this work, scientists have identified that patients with the exact same symptom have lesions in completely different parts of their brain. This is something that they find surprising, and they want to know, why is this the case? What explains this? How did different causes all produce the exact same effect? One of the ways that this is explained is when they compare the pathways and networks of connections in the brain. Each of these different lesions is causally connected up to, and it converges on the same shared area, which is present in the same brain network. This is related to what is often called the final common pathway structure. What this structure involves are different heterogeneous upstream causes that all converge on and operate through the same shared area. This kind of structure explains what unifies these causes together and why it's the case that they all produce the exact same symptom. So it's the unique feature of this type of causal structure that helps explain this outcome. Part of what this shows is that we need more than just an account of causation. We need to capture these unique types of causal structures because they are taking on a significant explanatory burden that we haven't yet appreciated. The third type of causal pluralism that I'm discussing here, structural pluralism about causation, has received a surprisingly small amount of attention in the philosophical literature. I think that future work on the philosophy and theory of causation will start to examine these types of differences in structures more. They have a ton to tell us about different types of explanations in science, different behaviors that a system can produce, and about the causal diversity of the world. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is whether there's a monist view about causal structure. There are many versions of this view that come up, and a number of them are captured by common claims that the causal structure of the world is mechanistic, that it's entirely mechanistic. The suggestion sometimes implies that all of the structures on this slide are really mechanisms. These claims, of course, depend and hinge on what you mean by mechanism, right? How it's defined. You can define mechanism so loosely and so broadly that it just means causal system. And then when you do this, of course, it's trivially true that all of these structures are mechanisms because they're all causal systems, but that's not very helpful. And it doesn't encourage us to appreciate the differences across them, which is important. And then when you do this, mechanism also just loses its meaning. We think it means more than just causal structure. On other views and other ways of understanding mechanism, It does refer to a causal structure with particular features. Often it's got this nested hierarchical structure, lower level causes, all interacting together to produce a higher level effect. The problem here is that whatever particular features you claim are unique to a mechanism, you can almost always find a causal system that lacks those features and has different ones. So then it's very difficult to say that all of those other systems are mechanisms and that the entire world is mechanistic. Part of what is emerging from this analysis is that it's always important to clarify what is meant by causation and what we mean by our causal terms. So when you're studying a causal system and you're identifying what causes explain an outcome, it's helpful to consider what kind of causal structure it is. And what I mean by this is it's helpful to identify the additional features of the system that are unique to it beyond its just being causal. It's important to identify these features because they're often a key to understanding the behavior of the system and to clearly communicating it to other audiences, whether they're scientists or anyone else. So a main takeaway here is that clarity in discussions of causation is important for progress in science and the communication of scientific work. When we see and make reference to different types of causes in the world, we should be very clear about what kind of causal pluralism, if any, this relates to. We should aim to capture scientifically rigorous conceptions of causation, but also conceptions that capture the apparent diversity of causal systems in the world. Now, in conclusion, I have discussed three main types of causal pluralism: definitional pluralism, methodological pluralism, and structural pluralism. I've indicated that definitional pluralism is very open to debate. One thing that I've suggested is, in this context, we really need to be clear about what is meant by causation, whether our conception is similar or different to the conceptions that others are using. A second thing I've suggested is that while I think we should be open to there being many different definitions of causation, we also need to specify limits and standards that an account should meet. This shouldn't be an anything goes type of project. We want a rigorous account and understanding of causation. We expect them to meet particular rigorous standards. Second, methodological pluralism is really not a problem. One of the main reasons why we need to take note of it is because we don't want to assume that this implies definitional pluralism. We can have lots of different methods in science for identifying causation. This doesn't mean that there's a single definition of causation. So we just need to be careful about this. And third, and finally, I've outlined structural pluralism and indicated that this should be appreciated more. It's been difficult for scholars to clearly distinguish this type from definitional pluralism. It's a fruitful area for future research, and it matters because it helps us capture the diverse and complex nature of the causal world, which is really a first step in understanding it and in communicating it to others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Lauren. Extremely insightful talk and presenting that complexity, diversity in such a accessible way. I really, really appreciate. In moving to the panel, I would like to use my privilege of chair in asking you a question that, in particular, your last facets of the diversity of causal structure and pattern, the linear, the feedback, the bow tie, and cascading. It is something that I found extremely interesting, and I suspect it applied for the mapping the functioning of the brain or the functioning of supply chain or others. My question to you is that very often in AI or other aspects of data science, there is a kind of a clear distinction done between examining for causation or for prediction. Do you think that part of the lack of ability of linking causation to prediction is because we don't tap into enough of this complexity of diversity of causal structure.
Yes, so I think one of the confusing things in examining whether whether we have an understanding of a causal system when we have predictions is that causal information, one of the reasons why we're interested in causation is because it allows us to make predictions. But of course, it's not the only thing that allows us to make predictions. Correlations can allow us to do this as well. So we don't need to know about the underlying causal structure or causal mechanism of a system to get useful predictions. So it's one of the things that causation can provide, but causation doesn't own prediction. We can get this in other ways. Causation owns explanation and it owns control. So if you want to take the next step and not just predict whether someone gets a disease, but you want to do something about it, you don't just want to diagnose it, you want to treat it, prevent it, cure it, you want to tell them why they got it. You can't do that with just a prediction. So, so yes, I do think that distinguishing the sense in which causation gives us control from other types of information that don't give us control but give us prediction can helpfully capture the difference between really understanding the underlying causal components of a system and giving an explanation and being able to change an outcome to prevent a disease from just being able to reliably predict it, which is also very useful. But in medicine, we're in the business of doing more than that.
So yes, and before shifting to Sean for opening the panel, maybe just a quick follow-up, because this distinction you make between explanation and control bring me back to a discussion we're having on a panel, not that in the previous webinar, I believe. Then how could you integrate more of this into medical science that is still very much anchored primarily in our city? How could this integration of this more complex understanding of causation being integrated into the practice of medicine, the practice and science of medicine that still rely very much on our city primarily?
One of the important ways that I think this work can have and should have real impact on medicine and science is in helping in communication. So I do think that philosophers of science who are interested in causation and want to get the best account, they pay attention to science. They're studying the methods scientists use when they're successful. That's how we build our accounts. The best accounts care about science. But what's interesting is that while scientists have that kind of, they have the right intuition and they have the methods that we care about, they're just less used to communicating about them to other audiences. And, you know, they don't talk about causation in the way that I've presented here. They're not connecting it up to definitions. So a first main way is just communication. I've seen scientists talk with each other and they might have the same notion of causation in mind, but they aren't able to communicate about it clearly enough to realize that, or to figure out where their disagreement lies. So the first point is just communication. And I think with that, lots of things drop out. I think there are very similar types of methods that they're using and similar patterns that we find. Some of these patterns, you know, we talk about proximal and distal causes in when we talk about social causes in medicine, we talk about it in metabolic pathways. So once we can communicate more clearly, we can start to see that the systems we're looking at crop up in different domains, but there's the same kind of thing going on. You have a linear causal chain where you have this final common pathway. So, you know, the job of a philosopher is to try to see these connections and to try to be very clear about causal language. So this is something, so, we learn from scientists, and hopefully we can help in clarity in these discussions. But if we really want to reap the benefits of an interdisciplinary science, then communication is the first step.
Thank you very much. Sean, shifting to you to start the panel.
Sure. But before we start the panel, we do have a question in the chat window that I'll share from Lena. I'm not even going to try to say your last name. I apologize. It's very long and I will butcher it. But Lena says, this is a great talk. Thank you. I wonder if you can comment on the issue of temporality and whether it sets credible limits to causal arguments. I wonder if causes and effects may have varying temporal relationships in several complex systems of neuroscience in particular. That's it.
One of the distinctions that I've mentioned in this talk, and that is appreciated in some of this literature, is the sense in which causes can have effects that vary with respect to their speed. Usually it's always the case that the systems I'm looking at have a cause that occurs temporally before the effect. Many philosophers and scholars view this as a kind of constraint on how we should understand causation in a causal system. It's very mysterious when someone suggests that a cause can happen after the effect. So usually it's the case that causes are preceding their effects temporally. There are other important distinctions that have to do with time that relate to the speed of causes. So if you look at different timescales of interest across different sciences, in geology, the timescale is quite long. In biochemistry and metabolism, it's super short. So one thing that's interesting is scientists will dismiss some causes that are really slow if they don't fit into their timescale of interest. So in biochemistry, you need enzymes to speed things up. And those are an important causal factor. You could have a chemical reaction that will take place, it's favorable, but it'll take millions of years. And so scientists will say, even though this will happen, you can actually kind of dismiss that this is a genuine causal relationship without the enzyme because it doesn't happen within their time scale of interest. So this is just to indicate that context matters when you're identifying cause-effect relationships. Part of the context is the temporal scale that the scientist is interested in. And of course, as humans, we're often interested in things in our own, when it comes to medicine, especially the time scale of our own life. But these are a number of ways in which time and time scale show up in providing causal explanations and identifying something as a true cause.
Thanks. And the questioner thanks you in the chat window. So thank you, Lauren. It's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, and good to see you again, Amir. We spent some time together at McGill, although I don't know if we ever really interacted while I was there, but Amir is the director of the Brain Imaging Signals Lab and a core faculty member of the McConnell Brain Imaging Center at the Montreal Neurologic Institute. He's a professor at McGill's University's departments of neurology, neurosurgery, physiology, and biomedical engineering. So I will turn it over to you, Amir, for your commentary on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for the invitation and letting me speak here. So I think that, well, first, thank you very much, Lauren, for this very enlightening talk. I think that the best contribution that I can make to this discussion is give some practical, like practicality. I don't think every day about causality. I'm trying to use simple models of causality to explain phenomena. So I want maybe to explain or present some practicalities in my field. The example I will give is about neurophysiology measured simultaneously with functional MRI. And suppose we're doing that in order to predict the so-called Granger causality that has some temporal element to it in relation to Lena's question just earlier. And my comment about that, so, we have functional MRI, very slow time scale, and also sampled, say at 1 sample per second. And we have neurophysiology, very fast signals that are sampled at 1 sample, or let's say 48 kilohertz. So very, very many samples. And the question is, can we rely on any of them in order to predict if node A drives node C, or if B drives node C? In the context of Granger causality, which in my view is more correlation, not so much causation, but people are using it in the literature. And this is the debate that that took place in neuroscience for a long time in neuroimaging. And as I thought, eventually the debate ended up by, well, we have to believe neurophysiology much better, right? The time scale is much faster than functional MRI, so it's more reliable. So I'm bringing this up, perhaps as part of the selection of methodology or methodology pluralism, but maybe the methodology here is Granger causality, so it's measurement pluralism. Okay, we selected a method. Which measurements, which observation we can use in order to test a causality or not? Sean, feel free to stop me. I have some additional slides on similar matters. And the next one is about sufficiency and necessary causal conditions. From the same work with David Leopold, still on neurophysiology, simultaneous with fMRI, spontaneous. We didn't use any stimuli, etc. So we see that we have various signals of neurophysiology that shows the same type of correlation with fMRI. So there are many types of neurophysiology. Which of them is really necessary or sufficient, right? That's something important. And as far as I understand the brain, if we eliminate any of them, the whole phenomena would not be there. But it doesn't mean that's maybe with regard to the proximity, right? It doesn't mean that there is no one signal that eventually causes the changes in fMRI. The third comment is about we really need to have appropriate controls. One of the controls that are used in my field is to, when we see a phenomenon, when we see a correlation or a causation, such as Granger, we shuffle the signals that we correlate. And that's an example for a control that we have to do. Of course, there are many other controls, but I'm just promoting here, whenever somebody reports causality, would be great to do appropriate controls to nail it down as much as possible. So in this case, once we interfere with the simultaneity of the measurement, we shuffle the signal. We don't get this correlation anymore, right, with any of the signals. And if I have one more minute, I can tell you my view and what I learned and from Laurent's talk. First, we absolutely need definitions, taxonomy. We need to report clearly what we mean by causation, which type of causation we are talking about. We need to predict what the findings that we report on would mean if observations are made on a different spatial or temporal scale. In my case, neurophysiology and functional MRI. And I recommend, again, in fields similar to mine, to use multi-scale observations in the brain, because the brain has, like very many spatial and temporal scales, and they all matter, and we can learn from one on the other and vice versa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amir. Lauren, do you want to take an opportunity to comment on Amir's comments?
Absolutely. Yes, this was great and very helpful. The first point that you mentioned relates in a way that's helpful to what Laurent, and it reminds me of what Laurent had mentioned with respect to prediction. So the first point has to do with Granger causality and some of these other methods and techniques. I think Granger causality is a good example of where we've gotten prediction confused with causation, where there's, so it's my understanding that many scientists use Granger causality, but they don't think that it's capturing causation. It's not correctly named, that it is prediction. And prediction alone is not causation. I actually think it's helpful to think of Granger causality in terms of those probabilistic accounts. You can have something that increases the probability of an outcome without causing it. And so just identifying that isn't going to give you any kind of reliable distinction between true causation and mere correlation. So Granger causality is better understood as a tool that is providing useful predictions. And this is something that scientists state, even though Granger referred to it, even he indicated this, and the scientists who use it. It's not really, it's poorly named. It's not, it's about prediction, not causation. So it's very helpful to keep these distinct. And then the second point has to do with necessary and sufficient conditions. This is so interesting, and it comes up in many discussions of causation. And it's related to prediction, and it's related to the regularity accounts, the first account that I mentioned. You can find something, so relationships of necessity and sufficiency are logical relationships. This is how they're often understood. You can find something that is necessary for an outcome and sufficient for it, but that doesn't cause it. Regularity accounts, other versions of them, in particular, Mackey famously understood them in this way, Rothman in epidemiology. You identify regularities on the basis of necessary and sufficient conditions. I guess a quick and easy way to show this is the Lyme's disease example I presented, the bullseye rash. Hey, that's necessary and sufficient for Lyme's disease, but it's not a cause of it. So we're going to need to do better than necessary and sufficient conditions. And there's just a ton of work on this topic. And there's lots of complicated things it relates to. You can start to frame that in terms of control and then ask about necessity and sufficiency in terms of an interventionist account. But if it's just mere, necessary and sufficient conditions in a logical sense, it's not going to distinguish correlations, some of these counterexamples that show up. And yeah, so I think part of what this points to is the sense in which it's very fruitful to connect up these methods that scientists use and the way they think about causation to the decades and millennia of work that philosophers have done on attempting to understand causation in their work in trying to specify, to see, does the necessary and sufficient thing work? Does the probabilistic thing work? There's lots of really fruitful connections here where I think we can all learn from each other. And so I look forward to more of these discussions. And I think these points nicely connect up to the connections between science and philosophy.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Amir, if you want to have a last comment before we shift to Danny, which will be building very interestingly to this first. But Amir, you want to comment first, or I shift directly to Danny?
Well, first, I just want to make sure, do you guys see my slide? Or
Yeah, we do.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. Well, I agree with Lauren, right? We're maybe using different terms, etc., but I absolutely agree.
Okay, very good. So that's exactly the purpose of this next generation precision convergence among the many science. And shifting to Danny with extensive work on generative model and development brain dynamics over the life course can be very, very interesting build up. Let me first introduce Danny very, very briefly, and I will we will shift to the comments. Danny is the Peter Shirkanish Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Interestingly, in the Department of Bioengineering, Electrical and System Engineering, Physics and Astronomy, Neurology and Psychiatry. She is an external professor of the Santa Fe Institute. Why don't we shift to your comment, Danny, without further introduction?
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much. So just to expand a little bit upon my background, my work focuses on complex systems, which are systems composed of many units that are interconnected in particularly intricate ways. And the intricate connection patterns enable the system to display a really broad repertoire of dynamics and perform sophisticated functions. Examples of complex systems include the brain, the electrical power grid, your social network, and your dad's favorite dystopian novel. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk, Lauren, as always. And what I find most interesting about your approach, as articulated here, as well as in your published work, is the focus on the connection structures that can support distinct causal notions. So quite generally, the taxonomy, or I suppose you could say the zoology that you are providing, is refreshing because it allows us to be more precise about the explanations we are searching for, whether causal or non-causal, and could help us to more effectively design experiments to isolate particular causal structures. So in fact, I think that we have an opportunity to reshape how we pursue science in light of your work. So rather than designing a scientific experiment to test a hypothesis about how one variable impacts another, and then sort of post hoc determining which type of cause might be involved, we could instead develop a hypothesis about which causal structure might be present, and then design the experiment to probe whatever variables are most relevant for that hypothesized causal structure. So in other words, embracing the diverse causal structures you are putting forward, I think could really fundamentally alter how we do science by precisely reframing our hypotheses and our experimental design. But perhaps moving from the broad utility to science to the more specific utility for complex systems, which is my area of interest, your observation that diverse causal structures exist in physical and biological systems is important because the separate study of these structures could help us to better understand the relationships between a complex system's interconnection structure and its observed function or capabilities. And moreover, your observation could help us to better link a system's structure with the causal processes it could engage in or support. And the reason I raise these points is that complex systems typically evince connection patterns that are much larger than any of the structures you describe in your talk. And the breadth of those connection patterns suggests to me that multiple causal structures may exist in the system, perhaps located in different areas of the system and perhaps overlapping with one another, either structurally or temporally. And then, so some of my questions about your talk relate to this point. I'm interested in how causal structures, as you describe them, could coexist and be interdependent upon one another in complex systems like the brain. So if I had to isolate two questions I was really keen to get your thoughts on, the first would be, how could we think about systems that might combine separate causal structures in a particular pattern? So say a pathway followed by a bow tie, followed by a bottleneck, connected back to a pathway in a feedback loop. And then how do we understand the ways in which these causal structures might connect up together in complex systems specifically? And how do we understand the map between that particular constellation of causal structures and the functions that the system can perform? So that's one question, kind of the multiple causal structures and interdependence. The second question is related to how we can think about contextual factors and temporal factors that might alter the effectiveness of particular structural connections in a system, thereby transforming one potential causal structure into a different causal structure. Because the causal structures can depend on the underlying connections and their pattern. If you end up changing which connections are effective in any particular moment, then that may change the causes that are possible. And I'm particularly thinking about neuromodulators in neural systems because they can really drive differences in the effectiveness of particular connections. So might a brain evince these changing effective connection structures, thereby producing time-dependent causal structures? And if so, how might we begin detecting such productions?
Go ahead, Lauren. Fascinating question. Go ahead.
Yes, as always. Thank you so much, Danny. These are just super intriguing questions. I do think it's interesting because I think sometimes as philosophers, when we're focused on understanding causation and explanation, we will pick cases that are simple first and cases where there's consensus. We don't want to build our entire account off of a place where you guys all disagree. But then if you're really going to capture real science and the border, the cutting edge of science where you see scientists really defining their terms and grappling with these things, we want to account for that too. And so your work is obviously in this space and many others. So the multiple causal structure question is super fascinating to me. It makes me think of two things. First, when philosophers of science are interested in causation and saying something about what causes an effect, or they're interested in causal explanation and they want to say what causes explain something, what they usually do first is they fix the explanatory target. You can't say that that's a cause until you say what it's a cause of. And so there's often this step where you first say, okay, we want to explain why. And then we have to be super clear about what why is. Often there's a contrast. We want to know why, this presented, as opposed to, and you have to say what the other thing, the something else is. There's a sense in which this is a little limiting if you want to capture the full assortment of causal systems in a space, because in some sense it's helpful because it allows you to do this work of finding just the causes and just the systems relevant to that explanatory target. So I can't tell whether that's an advantage or a disadvantage. It's an advantage in the sense that it allows you to simplify and it allows you to say, no, that's a background condition. It looks like it's causally relevant, but if it doesn't give you control over this explanatory target, it's there, it's in the brain, but it isn't relevant to this. It doesn't explain this outcome we want. In that sense, it's helpful, but then a disadvantage of it is you aren't mapping the sense in which scientists start by first sometimes identifying these structures, and then they go talk about what they want to explain. So in discussions of anatomical connectivity in the brain, for example, in your work and in other types of work where there's an identification of causal connections or causal motifs, these are discussed without fixing the explanatory target first. And, if you think of the connections in the brain, those just exist and they are there. And then you can go ask what the explanatory target is. So I see that there are at least two different things that need to be kept in mind when we're thinking of how these multiple causal structures all exist together that I think will be helpful. There's a sense in which if you're just taking an overview of the system, almost as if you're looking at like the roadmaps of metabolic pathways or the anatomical connectivity of the brain, there's a kind of causal structure that exists there that you can specify without specifying the explanatory target. I think we need to take that kind of approach to thinking of the multiple causal structures and their interconnections. And then we also need to say, okay, we have them all. Here's how they're all connected. But what do we do with this? If we want to explain why, are some of these structures important and some of them not? Do I need to talk about the cascade that then hits a bottleneck, that then hits a final common pathway, that then hits a linear chain? Or do some of those structures emerge as more important or less? So that's in reference to the first point, and just a different way that I think these fields connect. The contextual question, actually, do you mind saying a little bit more about this, or?
Sure. Yeah, so at least in neural systems, there can be temporally varying distributions of neuromodulators, so chemicals, that would alter the effectiveness of a particular connection, and maybe allowing more information to be transmitted or less information to be transmitted, and that alteration, I think, would alter the structural pattern that's effectively there in the system, even though physically the link is still there. And so that drives me to think that there could be a change in the causal structure depending on these contextual factors.
Oh, absolutely. And that sounds fascinating. It sounds like a case where we would want to, it sounds like a case of complexity where we'd want to add another causal or explanatory factor into the system to fully account for what's happening. Almost as if you have a set of different possible metabolic pathways that are all present, but when you change the enzymes that are available, you change the different ways that something can flow down the various connections. So it definitely makes sense that that would be understood as a type of complexity. There are interesting ways in which I think it will connect up to other types of causal systems we think about where you need more than just the initial set of identified causes. You need some other factor. Sometimes they're viewed as background conditions, but in this case, I think we'd want to pull it out of the background and say, no, this is a cause that, or an explanatory factor that needs to be highlighted. So it sounds fascinating and a great place for philosophers focused on explanation and capturing these complex cases should look.
Great, thank you.
So letting you introduce the next presenter, the next panelist.
Sure. Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Louise Pessoa. I hope I said that correctly, Louise, who is a professor at the Department of Psychology and director of the Maryland Neuroimaging Center at the University of Maryland College Park, where his research interests center around studying interactions in the brain between emotion, motivation, and cognition. And he's also the author of The Entangled Brain, How Perception, Cognition, and Emotion Are Woven Together, which is to be published forthcoming, it sounds like. So please, Dr. Pessoa.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I actually pronounced it exactly. Yeah, it's Pessoa. Danny has beautifully outlined, described, summarized many of the ideas that I was going to ask you about, Lauren, about complex systems. And so let me sort of try to here on the fly rephrase things a little bit, continue with that theme a little bit, which is, here's one angle that I would like to hear your take, which is, by the way, you should have started that. Really loved your talk. It was it's phenomenal. I really, really enjoyed it. I think that we should put some version of that somewhere for people. Okay, you're thinking about this, go there and watch this for 20 minutes. So one thing that you mentioned that threw me off a little bit, which is interesting culturally, I think, because you said that philosophers like to tackle, it makes sense, that like to tackle, let's say, relatively simple cases that are well-defined and perhaps less controversial, because otherwise you would start from places where people already are in huge disagreement. But often we scientists like to start at the place where there's this huge confusion, because for better or for worse, we want to make our contributions to the cutting edge, if you will, and push the boundary forward in that sense. So why am I saying this? The reason I'm saying this is because so many of the systems that we as scientists are interested in and society needs us to understand, things about economies, complex health conditions in the whole planet, not to mention these small problems that Danny and several of us work on the brain, really have to do with complex systems. So it seems to me that is an area that is in huge need of clarification, because we need to make progress in these really challenging areas that affect us all, not to mention, I guess I forgot to mention climate. Climate is the most, perhaps if not the most important one that we need is, it's one could make, I think, an argument that it involves complex system type of relationships that are the most pressing of our time, that we have to understand causation, and we have to understand at least some aspect of controllability if we want to have the planet continue for millennia in the future. So I guess what I would suggest and want to hear a little bit about from you is your view of this need that we need to really engage in systems that really are at the forefront of challenging science and the conceptualization simultaneously. So much so that, as a follow-up question, I'd like to come back, but just to preempt are some ideas that we have about causation and causal structure and causal relationships actually up for redefinition or profound reconceptualization in systems that are so highly interdependent and with many complex pathways, loops, reciprocal connections, feedback, positive and negative, and so on, such that we have to understand these kinds of systems in different ways relative to the types of explanatory frameworks that are more rooted in standard causal thinking. So I guess I'll stop here, and then maybe we can come back to some of these questions later. But there's several other people who are going to be asking you questions, so I'll stop here.
Perfect. Great question. Thank you, Luis. It might be helpful for me to first say something about why philosophers focus on what I've called simple cases first. So philosophy is often focused on clarifying the fundamental nature of some of the sciences in some sense. We want to clarify how the scientific method works. And in some sense, this requires capturing the rigor of science, the concepts that are used, how they're understood. And so there is a different set of goals that philosophers of science are focused on than a standard scientist. There are different kinds of questions that we're asked, and our job is to answer these. And they're different questions. It's kind of about justifying science, which scientists aren't always in the business of doing this, or having, some of these more abstract discussions for all sorts of reasons. So there is a different focus on capturing the kind of fundamental nature of these sciences. What's the base that they rest on? And so if you do look to some of these cases, maybe it's not correct for me to view them as simple. Sometimes they're cases where there's consensus that are viewed as the kind of keystone examples of understanding or causation or explanation. So we want to use the cases that scientists think of as the kind of base of their work and base of their field to understand how that scientific field works. And then I guess another reason is if there is a simple example of a causal system, or an example where you guys all agree on it, there's consensus, this is legitimately causation. If we have a definition of causation that can't handle that case, well, we got a huge problem here. So before we even if I'm trying to define causation, I care about the super complex cases, but if my account can't handle the simple one, well, that's a first test for there being a kind of problem. We want it to handle those simple cases where there is consensus. And then what you can do is, once it handles these cases that are mainstream, where there's consensus, sometimes they're more simple, then you can take that definition of causation and you can try to see if it captures these more complex situations where current scientific work is happening. And just as you say, there is a little bit of a disconnect here, right? Because scientists aren't rediscovering the same thing necessarily. Their work is pushing at the border of what we know and attempting to understand new things, identify explanations for new targets, and understand these complex systems. So that was a little bit on why scientists focus on the consensus, why philosophers focus on consensus cases, and maybe simple examples first. there is a reason for why it's helpful for them to focus on the cutting edge of science. And the reason for this is that you guys talk more like philosophers when you're at the cutting edge of science, and you guys are doing more philosophy. And that's really interesting and helpful for us. So when there are, I see this a lot in psychiatry, where there's a lot of debate about whether this thing should be understood as a disease, what are the causes, how should we define our terms, how do we figure out whether this condition has single genetic or many different types of causes. So basically at those edges, you have scientists who are questioning their methods and their concepts, and they're doing work that's very compatible with philosophy. So this is very helpful for us in a place where we, I think, can open up these discussions more. And it's just nice because scientists can be more explicit about what causation is when they're dealing with some of these questions. I do think that causal complexity is a complex topic. Of course, it means different things too. There are two types of causal complexity that sometimes get brought into the pluralism debates. You will probably view them as pretty simple types of complexity, though. There are cases where you have multi-causality, many causes producing an outcome, or causes of situations of causal heterogeneity. Different causes can produce the same thing. Parkinson's disease could be caused by different things in different patients. So it is important for philosophers to start capturing other types of causal complexity, clarifying what they are, why they're challenging, and how scientists are able to navigate them and get around them. Sometimes we're trailing scientists, and sometimes we are probably helpfully included in how to conceive of the science. Sometimes it is better for us to kind of trail you and see how you figure out that, is that system causally complex? Is there causation in that system? Well, maybe we're not so sure yet. We're looking at how you use your methods. So
thank you, Lauren. Yeah. This last exchange convinced me more and more that we do need to invent this precision convergence science for solution to real world problem. Let's shift now to Peter Sterling, which I think can bring us to advance this discussion even further with his lifetime work on going from the molecule to society, and more, should not say more recently, it's already over the last decade, advancing this concepts of allostasis and making it happen in as real world context as possible. So Peter, why don't we shift to you?
Great. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so
3 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. So yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and I found this very interesting. My own career has traced proximal causes across different levels of organization. So, for example, light causes phototransduction. Phototransduction causes visual signals. Retinal signals cause visual cortex signals that finally cause a perception. And my concern now is that standard medicine identifies the low-level proximal cause, and then it stops. So, and it treats the lowest level, but often the final cause lies somewhere else and is better treated there. So I consider hypertension, very briefly, a major cause of death from vascular pathology. Normal blood pressure varies dynamically around 100 millimeters of mercury, and it produces arteries in cross-section that are wide open and healthy looking. Hypertension occurs when the mean pressure remains high. and it's way above this normal level, and it eventually evokes arterial muscles that hypertrophy, like skeletal muscles lifting weights. So the proximal cause of hypertension are commands from the brain. The brain commands the kidney to increase salt water in the blood system. It raises the heart rate, and it raises arterial resistance, and it even controls the salt appetite to increase salt consumption. So standard medicine treats each of these contributions to the proximal cause with a drug. For example, but the brain, of course, compensates. So if you give a diuretic, the kidney sheds salt water, but the heart rate increases. You can block that with a beta blocker, but arterial vessels increase. And then you can block that with a channel blocker. But what happens is that you reduce the pressure, but now you have a system that can't respond to changes in need. And moreover, each drug affects many other points. So a beta blocker increases blood glucose, which increases type 2 diabetes, and you treat that with more drugs, and you end up with a sick patient that was precariously stabilized by polypharmacy. So the proximal cause of brain commands to the blood pressure circuits is our mental state. And this is the record I showed you before, the systolic above, diastolic below. And each change in mental state produces some effect. Let's see, yeah. So here the subject is dozing in a lecture. It's 3 p.m, and he gets jabbed with a pin. His pressure rises, brain predicts danger. Then he looks around and realizes it's a prank. He goes back to sleep. And then there are many other ups and downs that are unidentified. But then at midnight, it's identified that he's become sexually aroused. His brain increases his pressure to allow him to participate. And then it comes crashing down, and then it rises again in the morning when he's coping with his life. So the brain recognizes context, predicts the need, and adjusts the pressure to match. Provides just enough, just in time. And and what the brain does is to set the mean pressure to the most likely need. The consequence is that blood pressures of people who live simply, like foragers and horticulturalists, are low, and they're steady with age. They don't increase. And this is true. This Nobe family, for example, waving to me, lives on Panama's Caribbean slope, 2 days walk from a market. Now, this is true for similar groups in Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. And so, but in the US, blood pressure starts to rise when children enter school. And by graduation, 25% are in the hypertensive range. And this reflects sustained physiological arousal, which is the rise is steepest for African Americans, who are the most stressed, because in the US, Black lives still don't matter. So to conclude, medicine should be tracing proximal causes across levels. They should treat at the highest level, and because that's the most effective, causes less iatrogenesis, and is far, far cheaper. Thank you.
Extremely interesting. Lauren, quick comment? Go ahead.
Absolutely. I completely agree with your concern, Peter, and I think we need to do a better job of capturing different types of causes that matter for health outcomes. One of the things we need in this context is we need clear reasons for why some of these higher level environmental or social factors are more important causes than these lower level biological ones. Part of what we need here is a reason, a justification, and an argument for why, in a principled way, those causes are more explanatorily powerful and more responsible for these outcomes than others. And I totally agree that biomedicine has not been focused on them. It's much more focused on lower level causal factors. One of the advantages of an interventionist account is it captures causation across levels. If you intervene on social structure and you change the resources that a community has, health insurance, well, that's just, you can think of that as just something you can intervene on and wiggle. If that changes their health outcome, it's a cause. You don't need a physical connection. You don't need all the detailed mechanisms. You just need that kind of counterfactual control. So that's a first step in arguing that important social things like racism, like access to resources are legitimate causes for outcomes that we see in society and social inequities, and that trying to go to those proximal lower level causes isn't as good because they don't give you control over that outcome. So this requires clarity about causation. It requires arguments about why some causes are more important than others. There are some distal causes, some higher level social causes that are more important, and they're more responsible, and they're to blame for these outcomes. This matters because those are the things we need to target to change them. But this requires good arguments. And this is a place where philosophy of causation can join forces with what's sometimes called structural competency in medicine and make some of these cases in a rigorous way. So I totally agree. I found that very helpful, and I share your concerns.
Thank you. In interest of time, we are shifting now to the last two panelists that are on the practice side of impacting human behavior, one in psychiatry and one in real world consumption context. So if it's okay, we will introduce them and have them make comment. And then Laurent will have you comment on both of them after, at the same time as you give your overall kind of insights. Sean, why don't I let you introduce the next panelist?
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Is it Shan or Shan?
It's Sean, just like you.
Oh, okay. I was wondering that now I have another unique spelling of Sean. Great. So Dr. Sean Siddiqui, who is a assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, a neuropsychiatrist at the Center for Brain-Mind Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the director of the psychiatric neuromodulation research at the Center for Brain Circuit Therapeutics. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Siddiqui, and please, your commentary.
Thank you. So my work is primarily focused on causal mapping of human brain function with the idea of finding treatments. So I think Lauren's points about pluralism are clearly illustrated by this diversity that we're seeing, as Lauren was just pointing out. We've got all sorts of different people from different backgrounds. But and I think it's useful to reconcile some of this diversity by highlighting different contexts that might require different approaches to pluralism. So, each discipline will have its own taxonomy and its own framework potentially. In our work, we try to produce that taxonomy and framework for human brain mapping. But I think other fields will have their own approach. So for example, I hear about Danny and others talking about unpacking the structural approach, which is necessary if our goal is to explain phenomena. But as a physician, I think more about the interventionist approach. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm in the unique position of treating diseases of a complex system that we don't understand. And my patients don't care if I understand their disease, they care if I can treat it. But as a scientist, I need to use other approaches to find the intervention. So in my work, we primarily use a probabilistic approach. And again, to address Laura's earlier question, there's an overemphasis on randomized controlled trials in clinical science. Sometimes before we can do a randomized trial, we need a causal hypothesis. The first ever randomized trial was streptomycin for tuberculosis. They already knew that streptomycin kills mycobacteria. But in clinical medicine, what's happened now is that if something is not supported by a randomized trial, then it's not causal and it's not good medicine, which leads people to erroneously malign treatments just because they're impractical to study in a clinical trial. So I think I think these contexts could be defined by the four reasons for causality research that Lauren mentioned. And if it's okay, I took a couple of notes on the other presenters that I'd like to share, if that's okay. These are the four things that Lauren said.
In your 3 minutes, go ahead.
I'll be very fast.
Okay.
4 reasons, 3 approaches of pluralism, and 4 definitions for causality. Amir highlighted these things: prediction, methodological pluralism, and these kinds of definitions. Danny and Louise highlighted these things: explanation, structural pluralism, and process and interventionist accounts. And then Peter highlighted these things: explanation, definitional, regularity, process. And I won't go into detail about how everybody did all these things. And this is what I'm talking about. And so we all have different ways of doing it. And so I think we're not going to arrive at a common consensus, but I think in each of our fields need to define the appropriate approach. Now I'll stop there since we're pressed for time.
Very good. And let's shift to Ayelet now. Last but not least, she's a long-time collaborator in the space of management and consumer research. Is Jeffrey Breckenridge Keller, professor of behavioral science and marketing at the University of Chicago at the Booth School of Business. So why don't I let you go ahead, Ayala?
Absolutely. Fascinating talk, great discussion. I realize that we are running out of time, so I will be very brief with my comments, and if Lauren has time to address them, then that would be great. If not, I understand that we are under a time crunch here. I was very interested in thinking about the philosophy of causality and how it is applied to behavioral science. I'm a social scientist, I'm a behavioral scientist. I study motivation in particular in the field of social psychology. And when we do our research, we often assume that the independent variable caused the dependent variable, and often the question is when does it not? Okay, and so I was kind of interested, Lauren, when you were very determined when you said that something is not a cause. Okay, so you were saying like bullseye ration, that does not cause Lyme disease, and there were a few examples who say that this is not the cause. But then when you said about something that is the cause, there was, well, depending on the definition, and I was kind of curious to know whether there is a definition of what is not a cause. There seemed to be much more conceptual clarity on that, which is intuitive to me, but I wasn't sure where is that. You know, what is the definition? Like what needs to happen so that by some definition something is a cause? And with this regard, I know that for us behavioral scientists, often the question is about process, and you kind of said that maybe mechanism is the same question as a cause, but I don't think that when we ask about process, we really ask about whether the IV caused the DV. We asked how the manipulation created the outcome. Okay, and so the standard methods to look at it are in terms of methods, moderation and mediation. Okay, so I can ask, for example, why presenting food as healthy reduces taste perception, reduces consumption. And then the process can be because people perceive a conflict between health and good taste. And my moderation test would be to see whether people that perceive this conflict are more likely to display the causal effect. My mediation test would be whether people going to infer when I present food as healthy that it's less tasty, and as a result be less interested in consuming it. And so most of the discussion is really about how to infer underlying forces and less about causality, at least in the behavioral science. And I don't know if you have time to comment on this, but I will stop here. I have another question. It's less important. Back to you, Lauren.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll start with this nice mention of intermediates between a cause and an effect, and the sense in which we're sometimes interested in how. One distinction that's helpful for me in the context of understanding causation and causal systems is that it's one thing to want to know that something is a cause of something else, and it's a completely different other question to want to know how it does. So if you're coming up with a definition of causation and you want to be able to distinguish true causal relationships, genuine causal relationships from mere correlations, you want to know what is it that allows you to say that something, that X is a cause of Y. Notice that in many of the techniques that are used to identify causation in the world, like randomized controlled trials, even Robert Koch's work, Robert Koch has the first causal proof that shows that a bacteria causes a disease. He set up these experiments where he introduced this bacteria into animal models, And then in others, he didn't introduce it. He introduced saline that was free of the bacteria. What he used this to show is that that bacteria is a cause of this disease, and it was accepted as a causal proof by the entire community. This is revered as the first, one of the first causal methods. But what's interesting is he had no idea how that bacteria caused the disease. He had no idea what the intermediate steps were. You don't need to know the intermediate steps to determine whether X is a cause of Y. You need other types of things. So if the goal is distinguishing cause from correlation and defining causation, we're more interested in knowing what it means to say that X is a cause of Y. If we want more detail about the system, we want to know how, then we're often interested in getting those intermediates. Sometimes it's referred to as a mechanism where you get more information about the steps. And so I think this just points to the fact that we're interested in causation for all sorts of reasons. If you want to provide a detailed causal explanation, usually, we want to know more than just one upstream distal cause. Usually we want the mechanism. So one of the things that comes up in these discussions is how much detail do you need to provide an explanation? But causation itself, I think it's helpful to keep these distinct, knowing that X causes Y, knowing how X causes Y. With respect to the first question you asked, part of what's going on in the attempts to define causation is we're using cases that we think are paradigmatic examples of causation and mere correlation. So we look at the case like Lyme's disease and we look at the rash, and we just about all agree that the rash isn't a cause of this disease. Other examples come up that capture the same common cause situation. One example is smoking causes both yellow teeth and it causes lung cancer. Yellow teeth and lung cancer are correlated, but yellow teeth doesn't cause lung cancer. So we use these cases where we all agree that these are just correlated to guide the definition or account of causation we use. And hopefully part of what I intended to suggest is that I am here to help provide a taxonomy. I have my own views about which of these types of pluralism are more compelling, but I think it's more helpful for me to present these types so that scientists can decide for themselves and so that we can open up discussion. So this is kind of why I've suggested that we all agree that's not a cause, but whether, that there is flexibility here and room for debate. I mean, these are accounts of causation that humans are providing that are respecting science and our understanding of the world. So this is all up for debate, but there are reasons to view some of them as stronger than others. And then with respect to Sean's questions, yes, I really like the involvement of context. I do think and I really love that diagram where you're mapping these connections between different views. And I do think that that's something helpful to come back to. When we disagree about causation, what are we disagreeing about? Is it about the method or the definition? And if it's about the definition, let's be super clear here. Does someone hold a probabilistic definition of causation? If they do, there are some problems for those accounts that we need to talk about. Do they really hold that, or is it more of an interventionist definition? So having these discussions is important. I'm fully open to there being different contexts where we're going to need different, we're going to need to add different things to a framework for capturing causation and causal explanation. It's really interesting to hear you talk about how patients don't care if you understand the disease, that's just that you treat it. And that makes complete sense to me. If we're interested in causation, I think what we often find is that your ability to treat a disease usually tracks your causal understanding of it. So right now in different, in psychiatry and different areas of medicine, we think we can provide better treatments when we know the causes of the disease versus just addressing something that is a symptom as opposed to the root cause. So I think there's a lot to say here. And I do think the perturbation type of causation that often comes up in your work relates to or provides a helpful account of understanding causation. So I'll leave it at that and see if there's other follow-up comments.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We will start our roundtable of starting with you, Lauren, but all the panelists as well. Where do we go from here? In a 30-second, 1 minute comment maximum. I would invite all the panelists to get on. We will go in the order of the presentation of the panel. Your 30 second, 1 minute, or how should we go in inventing together this next generation precision convergence science? And Sean will end by his commentary, as well as introducing our next co-chair for the series next year. So Lauren, starting with you, just one key point, and the last two presenters were to bring two panelists were to bring the science of practice with the science of basic mechanism. And how could we move in bridging Sean's practice in psychiatry with the science of the brain or Ayelet's practice of consumer behavior and the understanding of the brain? That's a key next step where we need to move in moving toward this precision convergence. So starting with you, Lauren, your 30-second, 1 minute closing comment for how to move next step.
Great. Well, I think one thing that we need to do is we do need to take the practical work seriously. This is what we should, this is what should be figuring into how we understand complex theoretical terms in science like causation. We do need to combine it with a rigorous theoretical assessment, which we get more from certain types of academic work. So we need both of them. I think part of what Peter had mentioned earlier, we need to find ways to connect up causes at different levels. This is a multi-scale, multi-mechanism, multi-causal system. We need to span those scales. We also need to communicate more, and we need to focus on communicating clearly. So I think opening up these discussions more and trying to use a kind of taxonomy like I've provided and a kind of framework to help guide us as we discuss these questions more, working to be extremely clear about what we mean by our terms. This is something that philosophers spend a lot of time doing, and it's not always fun, but it's helpful for scientists to do this too. And it's helpful for philosophers to figure out if we're capturing science the right kind of way. So we need a lot of people at the table, and we need to start talking more. And a final thing is we need to specify the goals.
Mm-hmm.
What are we trying to do? And then clarity and
Thank you. Amir, shifting to you, your 30-second words of wisdom.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with Lauren. I think that we need to start, well, in my field, we need models, causality models that work in multi-scale, both in space and in time. This also relates a little bit to a comment that Michael Wolfson wrote in the chat. He said, can we really do it? The brain is so complex, there's so many, etc. So what I want to say, well, when I was a PhD student, what I really wanted is an electrode on all the billions of neurons and all the billions of synapses. We cannot do that. And I don't think it will take many generations, if at all, if we can do that. Experimentally, we will always need to do some reduction, and we do need methods to be able to make models, causal models, any other models based on various approaches and multi-scale.
Thank you. Danny.
Yeah, I think my comment will be brief. I think that we need more conversations like this across the disciplinary boundaries of philosophy and science. So I think having more conversations between these two groups of individuals is what is going to be necessary to move forward.
That's good. And that's why this webinar is not just a webinar, it's a capacity building, and we do need more than talking, developing paradigm that allow to capture this. The next one, Louis.
Yes, I think what we need is exactly what Danny said. We need more communication. We need more people like Lauren who reaches out, who talks to us, who talks to people and doing the science, who's willing to exchange these ideas and to really break down these barriers that universities unfortunately are organized in ways that create barriers. We need to move beyond those. It doesn't conform to the way we think and do things anymore at this point in time in the 21st century. Yeah.
Peter.
Well, I thank you all for the very interesting session. And as they say in the US congressional hearings, I yield to the chair.
Okay, Sean.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll also keep it fast. So I think what I'm really realizing and learning here is that, again, we all have our own frameworks to causality. And I think what would benefit the field is, as Lauren was pointing out, not a single definition or not even necessarily a series of definitions, but a series of discipline-specific definitions, and so that we don't start talking past each other. As we know, again, like Lauren was saying, when I talk to other people about causality, they have their own ways of thinking about it. I have my ways, and we talk past each other. So I think if we each had our own definitions and stuck with those, that might help us move forward.
Ayelet.
Two comments. As the psychologist in me is curious to know how people think about causality. There is quite a bit of research on that, and I'm kind of curious to know whether people's model in mind correspond in any way to what Lauren presented here. My other comment is that it will be interesting to think about specific implications to behavioral science and how can we move the understanding of causality beyond the random assignment and A/B testing, which I think as a field we pretty much set on, and like that is causality.
Thank you, Sean. The other Sean, back to
Other
you.
Sean.
Go ahead.
The lesser Sean. Thank you for a wonderfully stimulating conversation and presentation. That was great, Lauren. I do want to share a bit of news with the webinar as of tomorrow. Tomorrow will be my last day at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. I'm moving on to lead the Cray programming environment at Hewlett-Packard Enterprises on Monday, starting Monday. And so I will be no longer co-chairing this. I'd like to introduce my successor, if you'd like to turn his camera on, and Dr. Sergio Senilovich, who is the Director of User Support for Scientific Applications at the PSC, and he'll be succeeding me as the primary investigator of Bridges 2. So thank you, Sergio, for joining us and agreeing to take over as co-chair of the next round of Precision Convergence webinars.
Thank you very much, Sean. And I've had the privilege of attending some of these seminars. It's really a fascinating series, and I'm really, really excited to work with Laurette on getting it going. But let's end the season on a cliffhanger. If you really want to know more about me, you'll have to come back next season.
Yeah,
so back to you, Laurette.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And I can reassure you, Sean and I have been working for what, Sean? The last 3 or 4 jobs, we have been advancing what we call now precision convergence. So it will be a pleasure to continue with you, Sergio, next year. And I think that I was starting my introduction saying that this series was started a year ago only, where we coined this term of precision convergence. And I think, Lauren, thank you so much in terms of accepting to come back from a panelist to a keynote, because I think what your keynote and all the commentary convinced me more than ever that we are in the right direction, that if we are, as scientists of any breed, to bring real-world solutions, there's a next generation smart science for real world solution and with real world solution that we need to advance. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean. Let's keep having fun. Have a good summer, everyone. And we will be resuming in September to continue the work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.